We are used to disasters. We know about earthquakes, tornadoes, and floods of water. We know that nature can be cruel. But imagine dying in syrup. Imagine looking up and seeing a wave of dark, sticky goo, 25 feet high, moving at 35 miles per hour, crushing buildings like cardboard and snapping steel train tracks like twigs. It sounds like a bad cartoon. It sounds impossible. But on January 15th, 1919, in the north end of Boston, this actually happened. It remains the weirdest disaster in American history, a moment where corporate greed, bad engineering, and unseasonably warm weather combined to turn a sweet treat into a weapon of mass destruction. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. If you think history is boring, wait until you hear this. Hit that like button and let's travel back to 1919. Chapter 1. The Alcohol Rush. To understand why a giant tank of molasses exploded, you have to understand the time period. It was January 1919. World War I had just ended, but a new war was starting in America. The War on Alcohol. The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, was about to pass. This law would ban the sale of alcohol across the United States. Alcohol companies were in a panic. They knew that once the law passed, their business would die. So they were racing against the clock to produce as much industrial alcohol and rum as possible before the ban took effect. And how do you make industrial alcohol? You distill it from fermented molasses. Molasses is a thick, dark syrup, a byproduct of sugar refining. It's heavy, sticky, and in 1919, it was liquid gold. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol, wanted to cash in. They built a massive storage tank in the north end of Boston, a crowded neighborhood filled with Italian immigrants. Chapter 2. The Monster on Commercial Street. The tank was a monster. It stood 50 feet tall, about 5 stories, and 90 feet wide. It could hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. But there was a problem. The man in charge of building it, Arthur Gell, was not an engineer. He was an accountant. Arthur Gell didn't understand physics. He didn't understand pressure. He only understood money. To save cash and time, he cut every corner possible. He used steel that was too thin, half as thick as it should have been. He didn't test the tank with water first because water cost money. He ignored the workers who told him the rivets were popping out. As soon as the tank was filled, it started to leak. It leaked so badly that the entire neighborhood smelled like brown sugar. Local children would run up to the tank with sticks, scrape the leaking molasses off the sides, and make molasses popsicles. Instead of fixing the leaks, the company painted the tank brown so the leaks wouldn't be visible. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Chapter 3. The Warm Morning. January 15th, 1919. Usually, Boston is freezing in January, but on this day, a bizarre weather pattern caused the temperature to shoot up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4 degrees Celsius. It felt like spring. Inside the tank, something dangerous was happening. 2 days earlier, a fresh shipment of hot molasses from the Caribbean had been pumped into the tank. The warm syrup mixed with the cold syrup already inside. This mixture, combined with the warm weather outside, caused fermentation. The molasses was churning. It was producing carbon dioxide gas. Pressure was building inside the tank. The steel walls were groaning. Witnesses later said the tank sounded like a wild animal in pain. At 12:40 p.m., the north end was bustling. Workers were eating lunch. Children were playing near the harbor. A train was passing overhead on the elevated tracks. Chapter 4. The Explosion. It didn't start with a leak. It started with the sound like machine gun fire. Rat, 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 rat. That was the sound of thousands of steel rivets shooting out of the tank as the walls ripped apart. Then, a sound like a thunderclap shook the earth. The tank didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The sheer weight of 2.3 million gallons of molasses, which is 40% heavier than water, exploded outwards. A wave of molasses, 25 feet high, slammed into the streets of Boston. This wasn't a slow-moving spill, it was a tsunami. It was moving at 35 miles per hour. Chapter 5. The Destruction. The wave hit with the force of a freight train. The first thing it hit was the Boston Firehouse, Engine 31. The building was lifted off its foundation and smashed into pieces. 3 firefighters were trapped inside. Then it hit the elevated railway. The steel support beams of the train tracks were snapped in half. A train car filled with passengers was derailed and left dangling precariously over the sticky flood below. Buildings were flattened, houses were crushed, horses and wagons were swallowed whole. But the most terrifying part was the nature of the molasses itself. Molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid. When it moves fast, it acts like a solid. It didn't just wash over people, it battered them like a wall of bricks. And once it stopped moving, it became a trap. Chapter 6. The Sticky Death. As the wave settled, the streets of the North End were covered in a layer of syrup 2 to 3 feet deep. In basements, it was 10 feet deep. It wasn't like water. You couldn't swim in it. It was thick, viscous, and heavy. If you fell down, you couldn't get up. The more you struggled, the deeper you sunk. It was like quicksand, but sweet and sticky. Rescuers rushed to the scene. The first sailors from a nearby ship ran into the goo to pull people out, but the rescuers got stuck too. It was a nightmare scene. Men and horses were encased in amber-like syrup, looking like flies caught in a trap. The air was filled with the smell of sweet sugar and the screams of the dying. One of the victims was Pascale Iantosca, a 10-year-old boy who had been collecting firewood near the tank. The waves swallowed him instantly. Another was Maria D'Estasio, a young girl whose long hair got caught in the sticky mess, trapping her until she suffocated. It took hours for the rescuers to wade through the waist-deep goo. They had to use saws to cut through the hardened molasses to find bodies.
Chapter 7. The Aftermath. When the sun set on January 15, 1919, the North End of Boston looked like a war zone covered in brown sludge. The toll was devastating. 21 people were dead. 150 were injured. Dozens of horses were killed. Many had to be shot by police because they were trapped in the goo and couldn't be pulled out. The cleanup was a nightmare. You couldn't just hose it away with water. Cold water made the molasses harder. They had to use salt water from fireboats and scrub the streets with sand. For weeks, the entire city was sticky. Rescuers, police, and sightseers tracked the molasses all over Boston. It got onto subway seats, into payphones, and into people's homes. The hospitals were filled with victims covered in syrup, requiring nurses to cut off their clothes. But as the city tried to wash away the sugar, a new battle was brewing. Who was responsible? Chapter 8. The Anarchist Defense. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company knew they were in trouble. They had built a cheap tank, ignored the leaks, and killed 21 people. So they came up with a defense strategy that sounds very modern. Fake news. They claimed it wasn't a structural failure. They claimed it was a terrorist attack. In 1919, America was afraid of anarchists, political radicals who planted bombs. The company lawyers argued the tank didn't burst, it was blown up, Anarchists planted a bomb because our molasses is used to make alcohol for the military. They tried to paint themselves as victims of a hate crime rather than a negligent corporation. Chapter 9. The Trial of the Century. The victims' families didn't buy it. They sued. This led to one of the most important court cases in American history. Before this, corporations rarely paid for disasters. They usually blamed acts of God. The trial lasted 3 years. It involved 3,000 witnesses and 45,000 pages of testimony. It was a battle of science versus propaganda. The company brought in experts who swore they saw smoke and heard a bomb. The victims brought in real engineers. They showed pieces of the tank's steel. They proved the steel was too thin. They proved the rivets were overstressed. The final witness was a man named Colonel Hugh Ogden, the court-appointed auditor. He reviewed everything. Chapter 10. The Verdict. In 1925, 6 years after the flood, the verdict finally came down. Ogden ruled that there was no bomb. He stated clearly that the disaster was caused by structural weakness and the company's negligence. He pointed out that Arthur Gell, the accountant who oversaw the construction, ran the project to save money, not to save lives. The company was ordered to pay $625,000 in damages. In today's money, that's about $11 million. It doesn't sound like a lot for 21 lives, but in 1925, it was huge. It bankrupted the Purity Distilling Company. More importantly, it set a legal precedent. Corporations are responsible for the safety of their structures. Because of this flood, nearly every state in the USA passed laws requiring that engineers, not accountants, must sign off on major construction projects. Chapter 11. The Smell of Summer. The tank was never rebuilt. The site is now a park, Langone Park, in the North End. But for decades, the people of Boston claimed the disaster wasn't truly over. Locals swore that on hot summer days, when the sun beat down on the old streets, the ground would sweat molasses. For nearly 50 years, the North End smelled faintly of maple syrup and sweet rot. It became a local legend, the ghost smell of the Great Flood. Outro scene. Host stands in a park holding a jar of molasses. Today, there is only a small green plaque in Boston to mark the spot where the tank stood. Most tourists walk right past it without knowing that 100 years ago, a 25-foot wave of sugar killed 21 people right here. The Great Molasses Flood teaches us a strange lesson. Anything can be dangerous if you treat it with negligence, even something as sweet as candy. Arthur Gell tried to save a few bucks on steel, and it cost a fortune in lives. I want to know what you think. Is this the weirdest disaster you've ever heard of, or do you know something stranger? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this sticky journey into history, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe and ring the bell, because next week we are talking about the time it rained meat in Kentucky. Yes, really. Thanks for watching, and stay sweet.